today we're with Dudek. Dan, so do you just want to give us a little bit about your background? Maybe even just start with like where you went to college to now. I know it's a lot, but let's just start there. Let's give
Sure.
people some background.
Okay. Great. So I did my bachelor's degree at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Went on to do a master's and PhD at the University of California, Davis. I then went and worked for the federal government for a number of years, working on the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972. And I was working on problems of non-point sources of pollution, which are still a big challenge here in the North Country and elsewhere, because it really is it's the interface between agriculture and water quality that is so important in terms of non-point sources. And of course, dairy operations are a big part of that. And um, Ronald Reagan became president, decided that he didn't like as many federal employees working outside of Washington, where he couldn't get his hands on them. I was stationed in California at that time. So I was threatened with transfer, decided that instead I would go out and find a job. So I took a teaching job at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Taught there for a number of years, and then one day I got a telephone call saying, how'd you like to come to work for the Environmental Defense Fund? And so I was sitting grading a stack of gigantic blue books that day when the call came in, and I thought, this sounds cool. The chance to move from the chalkboard and its abstractions of reality to the reality of actually trying to test out some of the ideas that I was actually teaching at the time. So I said yes. That was in 1985, and I'm still with EDF now.
Okay, awesome. So just to go back a little bit, when I was reading about you on the EDF website, they mentioned something about you and Governor Schwarzenegger in California.
Yeah.
So was that before you got to the Environmental Defense Fund? And like, what was
No,
that?
no. The stuff I did was this is when Schwarzenegger was governor, and this is recall that California developed something called the AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, and part of that legislation, its intention was to try to set up a carbon market in California. So I was part of a handful of people nominated by the governor to be on its market advisory committee, which was impaneled to design that market, what it would look like and how it would operate in California. And of course, California's got one of the premier operations today, still functioning. So yeah, I was with EDF at that time. And that nomination came on the basis of all of the work that I've done on markets around the world.
So does that involve the cap and trade program too?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly
Okay.
right. Yeah.
So could you explain to people who don't know what that is? Could you just give like a summary of what cap and trade is?
Yeah. It's pretty straightforward, actually. What you do is you basically assign a limit, a hard limit in terms of what each individual source might be, let's say a power plant, how much they can emit. And you give them those, in some sense, emission permissions, they're called allowances, directly. You can either give them out to companies or you can auction them. In the case of California, what they do is they auction them and they take the revenue and use it for other mitigation investments. In the case of the acid rain program in the US, those were allocated to power plants on the basis of historic emissions. What you do then is you set up a monitor in each one of the stacks so that you can observe and monitor in real time what the emissions of the power plants are. That data is reported in real time to the EPA. And then what you do is you say to the companies, okay, if you can control more than what we've given you in terms of an allowance, that is, you can make a deeper cut, then that excess that you've done, the extra reduction, you can either bank and save for future years, or alternatively, you can sell it into a market. Now, most companies have a variety of sources. That is, if you look at a typical power company, they might have 15, 20, 100 different sources. So this gives them the opportunity to manage them all together as a unit. And maybe they're going to take the power plant offline to do some maintenance on it, let's say. So it's not using or drawing on those allowances at that time. Instead, they can move them to another facility, let's say, where they're in the process of investing in control equipment and haven't yet put it on. And so they need a little bit of extra, a few additional allowances. So you can think of this it's like a checkbook. The government makes an initial deposit in the checkbook, which are your allowances, your authorizations to emit. Withdrawals from the checkbook are the emissions that go up the stack, and you can make additional deposits by acquiring, borrowing, or purchasing additional allowances in the market. Again, the exemplar here has been the acid rain program in the U.S. set up by the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. It's been the single most powerful example that's been copied around the world in California, in the European Union, China, etc. So it was the flagship.
Yeah, no, it was huge. That's why I didn't want to not talk about it. So is cap and trade now a national thing, or which states have adopted it? Do you know off the top of your head? Maybe just rough.
Sure. California is the anchor in the West. There's something called the Western Climate Initiative, and the intention of that is to grow that to include the states of Washington and Oregon. And California also has an arrangement with Quebec, one of our neighbors here to the right, where they do actually a joint program. They allowances, they run a joint auction each year. They both have caps that is total limits on pollution discharge in both Quebec and in California. Ontario was going to join for a while, but then the political winds changed, and that didn't happen as planned. So in the East, what we have is something called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. That's in basically throughout the Northeast. We'll have some additional states. I think Virginia's going to join shortly. That involves only power plants. It's not as in California is for the entire economy in the state. So it's a much more limited scope here. RGGI is actually older than the program in California. Each state is allowed, sets up its allowances. They're auctioned off. Each state takes the revenue from those auctions and can spend it in whatever program meets the needs of the individual states. So some states are using it for things like energy efficiency investments, weatherization programs, for example, in the Northeast. So.
Okay, so it's not just limited to California then. It's expanded since then.
Absolutely.
Okay, and then let's go to the Environmental Defense Fund. So when I first looked at the Environmental Defense Fund, from what I saw, it seemed like an advocacy group. Like at its is that accurate to say?
Yeah, I mean, EDF is a little more than 50 years old now. We've, I think one of the uniquenesses of EDF is that we combine the talents of scientists, lawyers, and economists. And it's the economists that are, I think, the uniqueness of the organization. Most advocacy groups have scientists and lawyers. We began with a motto of, pardon my French, sue the bastards. And the initial work that EDF did was to do both the science and the litigation leading up to the banning of DDT. So that was our first big success here in the United States. And it started with tracing the impacts of DDT on reproductive failure of the osprey in Long Island Sound. Due to the thinning of the eggshells, the DDT was being sprayed to control mosquitoes so that the Wall Street denizens could enjoy their summers bite-free. But of course, that meant through the bioaccumulation in the food chain, that ospreys, a fish-eating bird, were getting high doses of DDT that caused reproductive failure. And so the folks, they had done the science, but tried to figure out, okay, we know what's going on, but how do we get at this problem with DDT spraying? So that was when they hired a lawyer, started litigation, and that was the beginning of EDF.
Okay, are you familiar with the Adirondack Council?
Absolutely.
So I worked for them this summer, and when I was reading your website, I saw a lot of familiarities between them and you guys. So do you also do like lobbying and like use and do research to push for certain laws? And
Absolutely, yeah. So for example, the first paper I wrote on climate change was how to use trees and the biota to offset carbon emissions. And it was basically an analysis and a proposal that, this was in 1985, by the way.
okay.
Basically say, well, if we really want to get going with this, what we ought to do is require that any new power plant built has to offset its emissions by planting new trees or protecting rainforests, etc. And I used that work then at EDF to form the basis of some Senate testimony. And that Senate testimony, the person sitting next to me was Jim Hansen. And this was the testimony at the committee hearing when he announced that the world was in fact warming. And so anyway, we were sort of bookended in that particular hearing.
It's fascinating seeing how
we do use that kind of work and analysis as the basis for advocacy. Similarly, in terms of the work we did on acid rain, we did research for years on the impacts of acid rain, particularly here in the Northeast, because we're downwind of the most of the major sources in the Midwest. So we did work on looking at impacts in terms of species changes and distribution of ducks, amphibians, fish, etc., particularly throughout the Northeast. Things like the accumulation of heavy metals, and by the way, what we have is an ongoing attack on the part of the current administration in relation to the air toxics regulation, which involves the deposition of lead, for example, in the lakes and in the Adirondacks, and also means that we still have fish advisories for pregnant women that are pregnant, nursing mothers, and small children. You can fish, but you can't eat them.
Yeah. Crazy. Yeah, no, it's amazing to me how I used to never think that these advocacy groups had a ton of influence, but when I started working with them, like I saw how much pull like you guys have, and it's just incredible. It's fascinating to me how these organizations work and nonprofit. It's incredible. So thank you for all that work.
You're
So
welcome.
working with such a large agency, how how have you seen other examples of these organizations doing certain work to mitigate climate change right now?
Sure. Um, well, I can let me go back a little bit and do a little bit more historical work
That's fine. That's
in
fine.
relation to companies because um, one of if you go back to the Kyoto Protocol, okay, which was November of 1997, when that was developed and negotiated in Japan, which seems like ancient history now, but the
Yeah.
Kyoto Protocol was the initial signature international or global effort to try to tackle climate change. Um, following on the Rio Convention. So I had an opportunity to work with British Petroleum, and BP at that time had a CEO, John Brown. He was interested in changing the company. In fact, for a while they had changed their name to Beyond Petroleum,
Mhm.
and they basically were interested in um, being uh, at the table rather than on the table in the sense of the negotiations. And they had business operations in over 80 countries, and they thought, gee, if we have to deal with 80 different uh, laws, regulations, strategies, that's going to be a huge amount of overhead. So wouldn't it be helpful to us if we had a single framework for grappling with climate change and greenhouse gases? So they were looking for ideas. I came in and pitched them on the idea of cap and trade. And through a set of experiments, internal experiments involving business units around the world, BP set up an internal cap, developed an internal trading system, and that system was first rolled out at Kyoto in terms. So it gave the negotiators the chance to, in some sense, kick the tires on this idea to see from a major company how they implemented it, what the challenges were, what the results were. So it had a huge impact because prior to that, there really, other than the acid rain program was only 2 years old. It had actually, implementation started in 1995, and that was on SO2 and acid rain, involved the US, and it was useful, but it was still not carbon and CO2. So that had a huge impact. So that was back in 90, and again in 97. That work started in 95, and with BP. Um, but fast forward to today, uh, one of our local companies that has a big presence here is Walmart. I'm sure most of us, certainly in any proximity to Potsdam, have seen the superstore, the supercenter there at Walmart. Now,
Yeah.
one of the things, Walmart's an interesting company, both from the standpoint of their size and what I would call their throw weight, their ability to influence things. So we have been working with Walmart for, I'd say probably at least a dozen years, if not longer. And we're the only major environmental organization that has an office in Bentonville, Arkansas,
Mm.
which is
Wow.
the headquarters of Walmart.
Oh,
And
okay. All right.
so Walmart has something called a gigaton challenge. And what they're doing is they want to take 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide out of their supply chain.
Wow.
So, that's when you think about that and their capacity to not only make that commitment, but influence all of the folks that are selling to them. And it turns out that, um, so, things like, think about laundry detergent, for example. Laundry detergent, particularly the liquid form, most of that's water. So what they figured out was, gee, if we get the water out, It's going to weigh less. We're not going to
Yeah.
be moving as much of that around, because who wants to be shipping water from one place to another? I mean, we do a lot of that, as you know already, anyway.
Yeah.
But that means a lot of extra carbon involved in transport. So why not have a concentrated form? Again, it involved lots of computation, but also thought about marketing. You think people might think, oh, we're getting cheated. This is a smaller container instead of this big thing that I'm used to,
Yeah.
et cetera. But they were able to drive those kinds of changes. They actually drove the economies of scale that put, let's say, LED bulbs. They used to be like $20 a pop, right?
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
go out and buy them for, cheaper than what incandescent bulbs used to cost. Yet there's a huge impact in terms of the reduction in carbon commitment associated with using those. So they've got the size and the scale to be able to actually not only market that, but make it a more acceptable to consumers. So that's huge. And they've been able to look across their business. They do things like put solar panels on top of their a lot of their operations, because those are giant flat roofs.
Yeah.
They're perfect for,
A lot of sun.
you think about the square footage that they have across their their global footprint. So getting a company of that scale and size engaged in the actual practical mechanics of how we're going to wring carbon out of our economy is enormous. Because that's the reality of what we have to do. It's one thing to say, oh, we got to set targets, we have to set limits, we want, 2 degrees, et cetera, et cetera. It's quite another thing of figuring out how we're going to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, when you approach like big companies with, like you're urging them to do all these, different techniques to mitigate climate change, I feel like the first reaction is, oh, this is going to cost me so much money. But in terms of, the Tide Pods, for example, or, that example you gave, companies seem like they're realizing implementing these innovative technologies that reduce their, environmental impact is actually having, a reduction in their operating costs, their production.
Absolutely.
And it's actually it's a better financial option for them than doing it the old ways.
Exactly. So I'll give you another example. We have been focusing a lot on methane as an organization, because methane is a short-lived climate pollutant compared with, let's say, carbon, which is long-lived. But methane has a much greater impact in terms of its warming potential than carbon. So focusing on methane gives you a much bigger kick in terms of reducing immediate warming impact. So methane, what's methane? Well, methane's natural gas. And so we've got oil and gas operations throughout the country. And there had been concern that the estimates used by the EPA in relation to leaks from wells producing natural gas, because we've had this explosion of fracking, which is another thing all throughout the Northeast that's highly controversial. In many places, the Marcellus Shale, which parts of which is in New York, going down into Pennsylvania, et cetera. These are areas that have been tapped and exploited in terms of the natural gas revolution. Now, the natural gas revolution has been good in one sense, because the falling prices of gas have meant that it's cheaper to use gas to produce electricity than to burn coal, and gas is a much less carbon-intensive fuel than coal. So we get a benefit there, but part of the problem has been the additional methane emissions associated with that supply chain for natural gas. So we started looking at where is that coming from, okay? And it turns out that most of that is associated with poor design of wells. And so the casements that are built, if they're not done properly, they end up leaking natural gas into the atmosphere. And some of these insights came from the Deepwater Horizon explosion, which I think 10 years ago, just recently.
Yeah.
Because that's part of what occurred there. So then that led us to do things like flyovers on production fields on some of these basins to try to do estimates. And then that led to partnerships with some of the large companies like Shell, for example, to give us access to their production fields so we can actually do on-site monitoring, come up with recommendations about how to change those practices. And those have turned up in terms of regulations that have been adopted first by states, then by the federal government. The Trump administration again has tried that. One of the first things they tried to do was to overturn those methane rules and regulations on controlling emissions. And there was a congressional vote, and I think that was the first defeat that Trump suffered in terms of his administration as Congress supported it. They're back at it again, trying to rip those off as well too. Any kind of environmental protection, they don't seem to are important to people. And we have this week we have the administration refusing to undertake the process for tightening of our particulate standards. Particulates lead to lung damage. Lung damage means that you're a lot more susceptible to COVID-19. Duh.
Yeah.
I mean, forget about trying to blame the WHO and pull their funding. How about let's just, clean the air and protect our people's health, first of all. So
yeah. It's amazing how it all the stuff we neglect just comes back to bite us.
Oh yes.
The food markets. Yeah, it's it's a mess. I don't know, but when you have a situation like this, it's a terrible situation, but it reminds everyone of what our priorities should be. Hopefully we learn something from it.
Yeah.
So I don't want to keep you for too long. So let's jump to where you are currently in Star Lake, right? So
actually, I'm in Potsdam right now.
Potsdam now. So, but you've been to Star Lake. You have I'll let you tell
I have a cabin there. Yeah.
Okay.
I've had for about 20 years. And
okay.
that led us to move to Potsdam about 8 years ago.
Star Lake's a beautiful area. I love it over there.
That's fabulous. It's really, really very cool.
So this is the question we've been waiting for. Since you've been in North Country, it hasn't been long compared to, how long the effects of climate change have been happening, but have you seen anything changing there?
I think again, so a couple of things. And again, they're very consistent with what people have forecasted for what we can expect under climate change. And that's a lot more variability. More, and the variability is in the extremes. A 30-degree swing in temperature within a few days is become relatively common now. But, dramatic. And, so that's just not, we used to, when we were first there, it was, every by Thanksgiving, we wouldn't see open water on the lake. This year, it was after Christmas, before we saw the lake that had actually, frozen in. So it was almost into the new year before we saw the lake frozen. So those kinds of extremes in terms of temperature, and I think, one of the things that has, I think it impacts, pretty directly, is because so much of the environment there is keyed into these temperature changes. Whether it's trees and plants and their cycle in relation to, blooming, or when it's time to, when it's safe to appear for example, uh, are all, all keyed into those temperature changes. So we get a lot of of sort of rapid change, which is outside the realm of normal experience, for the species that are living there.